The trunk hit the mud with a sound like a gunshot, and every soul on Redemption Hill turned to stare. Eliza Sutton stood at the bottom of that wretched slope with her hands pressed flat against her skirts, and her jaw set in the kind of rigid, brittle dignity that only a woman carrying a secret too heavy for her chest can manage. The rain had turned the hill into a river of red clay, and the stagecoach driver had already made his feelings perfectly clear when he deposited her baggage at the foot of it and clicked his horses forward without a second glance. Her trunk was enormous, battered, bound with two leather straps that had seen better years, and it weighed, she suspected, approximately as much as a small pony. It held everything she owned in this world, everything she was running from, everything she intended to become. The townsfolk of Millhaven, Texas, in the autumn of 1878, had gathered along the boardwalk of their single main street in that particular way that small towns gather when something interesting threatens to disturb their Wednesday. They watched her, they whispered behind their hands. A woman alone, arriving by stage, wearing good Eastern clothes gone damp at the hem, standing beside a trunk she clearly could not lift, that was interesting indeed. But none of them moved. The mercantile owner leaned against his door frame. The blacksmith had come out to look. Two women in bonnets had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. A preacher's wife clutched her Bible to her chest as though Eliza's predicament might be contagious, and not one of them crossed the street. Not one of them bent a knee or offered a hand. That was when Elias Langston came around the corner of the livery stable. He was not a large man in the way that men in dime novels are large. He was not broad as a barn door or tall as an oak tree. He was lean and sun-darkened, and moved with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years understanding exactly how much effort any given task required, and was unwilling to spend a single ounce more. He wore a gray hat that had been rained on so many times it had forgotten its original shape, and a duster that was the color of old cedar. His eyes, when they finally settled on Eliza's trunk, were the particular flat, opaque gray of thunderheads building over the lawn o' estacado. He stopped. He looked at the trunk. He looked at the hill. He looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back at him with every fiber of pride she possessed holding her spine straight, fully prepared to inform him that she required no assistance, that she was perfectly capable, that she had managed perfectly well on her own for the last 2 years since the world had collapsed around her ears, and she was not about to begin accepting charity from a stranger in a cattle town she'd only just arrived in. She did not get the chance to say any of it. Elias Langston crossed the street, picked up her trunk as though it were a hat box, settled it on his shoulder, and started up the hill. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eliza Sutton had ever heard. Nobody in Millhaven moved. Nobody breathed. The mercantile owner's mouth was open. One of the bonneted women had pressed her hand over her own mouth. The preacher's wife had gone so still she appeared to have been carved out of weather-beaten pine. Because in 15 years of living in and around Millhaven, Texas, Elias Langston had not done an unrequested kindness for a single living soul that anyone could remember. He paid his debts. He didn't start fights. He acknowledged the existence of other people with brief nods that passed for courtesy in cattle country. But he did not carry trunks. He did not offer help. He did not involve himself in the business of strangers. And yet there he was, halfway up the hill already, the trunk balanced on his shoulder, not looking back. Eliza's throat closed around something that was not quite a word and not quite a sob. Then she picked up her skirts and followed him, because what else in God's name was she supposed to do? That was how it began, with a trunk, with a hill, with a man who surprised an entire town and, as it would turn out over the long and complicated months that followed, surprised himself most of all. 6 weeks earlier, Eliza Sutton had been standing in the parlor of her late aunt's house in Richmond, Virginia, holding a letter that had just reordered the entire geography of her life. The house smelled of camphor and old roses, and the particular, suffocating grief of a place that has lost its primary occupant. Her Aunt Dorothea had died in August, leaving Eliza precisely nothing except the letter in her hand, a small leather traveling case, and directions to a man named Harlan Teague in a town called Millhaven, Texas, who had apparently corresponded with Dorothea for 15 years regarding a parcel of land that had, upon Dorothea's death, passed to Eliza by virtue of being her only surviving relation. Eliza was 26 years old. She had taught schoolchildren in Richmond for 4 years. She had been engaged once to a man named Cornelius Hatch, who had proven himself to be a liar and a coward and a thief in the span of a single terrible afternoon 2 years prior, and she had ended the engagement with the kind of clean, decisive cut that leaves a scar that never fully stops aching. She had no family left. She had a small savings account, a teaching certificate, and 63 acres of land in Texas she had never seen. She also had, if she were being honest with herself in the quiet of the Richmond parlor, a desperate and growing need for something entirely unlike her current life, something that could not be predicted or manipulated or taken from her, something that was hers. The journey from Richmond to Millhaven took 11 days, 3 different trains, and a final leg by stagecoach that she would prefer to never think about again. The stage rocked and plunged and smelled of horses, and the previous occupants piped tobacco, and Eliza spent much of it reading the single page of information she had about her land, turning it over in her hands, wondering if she had done something irretrievably foolish. The land, according to Harlan Teague's letter, was situated at the western edge of Millhaven's county, bordered on the north by a creek that ran year-round and on the south by what was described as rangeland currently in use by neighboring cattle operations. The house on the property was described as small but sound. The acreage was described as versatile. Neither of these descriptions, Eliza had already suspected, was entirely accurate. She was right about one of them. The house, which she was directed to by the Millhaven boarding house proprietress, a warm-faced woman named Mrs. Garvey, was indeed small. It was also missing 2 windows, had a porch step that crumbled beneath her right boot the moment she attempted to use it, and smelled of mice and several years of disuse. But the walls were solid enough, and the roof appeared to be on speaking terms with its purpose, and the creek that ran behind it made a sound like low, continuous conversation that Eliza found, to her own surprise, deeply comforting. She went back to Mrs. Garvey's boarding house to sleep that night, because the house on the land was in no condition for habitation, and she began making her plans. The trunk remained in her room at the boarding house for 3 days while she explored, made lists, spent money with careful deliberation, and tried to understand what she had walked into. She hired a local man named Chester Poole to help with immediate repairs, but Chester Poole had a drinking problem that interfered significantly with his carpentry, and after the 2nd day she thanked him for his efforts and paid him for the work he'd done and sent him on his way. She bought tools from the mercantile, a hammer and nails and lumber for the porch step, and fixed the step herself, which caused a brief but memorable scandal among the bonneted women who had nothing better to do with their Wednesday mornings than observe the behavior of newcomers. It was during this period that she first encountered Elias Langston, though neither of them knew it yet for what it would become. She was in the mercantile on her 4th day in Millhaven, negotiating the price of glass for her broken windows with the owner, a stout man named Briggs, when a voice behind her said, with no particular inflection, "He'll come down 30 cents a pane if you mention that you're going to be putting them in yourself." She turned. The man in the gray hat and the cedar-colored duster was examining a shelf of leather goods with his back mostly toward her, running his thumb along a strap of harness leather with the focused attention of a man who is pretending not to have just spoken. "I beg your pardon," Eliza said. Briggs, still not looking at her. "He respects competence. Mentioned Chester Poole last week when you sent him away. Called it good judgment." Eliza looked at Briggs, who was doing an impressive job of suddenly finding the surface of his counter fascinating. Then she looked back at the man in the gray hat. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to be direct, and her 2 years of painful experience had refined her directness into something that cut cleanly without drawing blood unnecessarily. He nodded once fractionally and went back to the harness leather. She mentioned to Briggs that she would be installing the windows herself, and Briggs came down 35 cents per pane, which she accepted with a satisfaction she felt all the way to her boots. She did not see the man in the gray hat again for 5 days. When she did, it was because he rode onto her land unannounced on a gray Tuesday morning, while she was attempting to determine whether the western fence line that separated her property from the neighboring rangeland was, in fact, on the correct side of the surveyor's markers she had spent an hour hunting for in the grass. He came on horseback, a dark bay mare with a white stocking on her left foreleg, and he stopped at a distance that she supposed was meant to be respectful and sat there a moment, watching her. "You're on Langston land," he said. Eliza straightened from where she'd been crouching over a half-buried stone marker and looked at him. She had enough experience with entitled men to recognize the particular texture of this statement, which was not a threat exactly, but was also not a threat. "I'm on my land," she said. "Eliza Sutton. I own the 63 acres north of this fence. The fence appears to have moved." A silence. Not hostile, more the silence of a man recalibrating. "Elias Langston," he said. 11,000 acres south of that fence." A pause. "When you say moved, I mean the current fence line appears to sit approximately 8 feet north of where the survey markers place the property boundary, which would put 8 feet of what is legally my land on your side of the fence." Another silence. His horse shifted weight. He looked at the fence, then at the markers she'd located, then at her, and something moved across his face that might have been respect or might have been simple arithmetical assessment. It was difficult to tell with him. She would learn, over time, that this was a consistent feature of Elias Langston. He kept his reactions internal until the moment he decided to express them, and the moment was always his choice. "I'll have my man Hector look at it," he said. "If the line's wrong, we'll move the fence." "I appreciate that," Eliza said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he turned his horse and rode south. She watched him go and tried to identify what she was feeling, which was difficult because it was several things at once. Wariness, because she had learned in painful detail that men who controlled significant amounts of land and resources tended to behave as though those resources entitled them to make decisions about everything in their vicinity. Cautious acknowledgement, because he had not argued or blustered or attempted to suggest she was mistaken. And something else, smaller, which she pushed firmly aside because she had not come to Texas to complicate her life with a feeling she couldn't afford. Hector, who turned out to be a compact, good-humored Mexican man in his 40s who had worked for the Langston operation for 12 years, appeared the following morning with a measuring tape and a cheerful willingness to discover the truth of the matter regardless of which direction it fell. He found the fence was indeed 8 feet off the proper line. He told her he would report to Mr. Langston and the fence would be moved within the week. It was moved within 3 days. Eliza, watching from her porch with a cup of coffee, observed this and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized was unsettled. She began to hear things about Elias Langston in the ordinary course of Millhaven's social life, which she engaged with carefully and selectively, attending Sunday services at the small Presbyterian church, and accepting occasional invitations to supper at Mrs. Garvey's boarding house, where the proprietress held a kind of informal court on Thursday evenings that served as the town's primary information exchange. What she heard was a portrait built of contradictions. He was fair in his business dealings, almost to a fault. She heard this from 3 different sources, each apparently still slightly surprised by it. He had bought the Langston ranch from his father, or what remained of it, at the age of 22, after his father's death had revealed debts that had consumed most of the estate. He had spent the next 13 years building it back through what appeared to be pure, relentless, focused work. He employed 12 men year-round and more during roundup, and he paid them honestly and on time, which in 1878 Texas was not as universal a practice as it should have been. He was 35 years old, had never married, had no known family remaining, and had, according to Mrs. Garvey, who delivered this information with the particular gentleness of someone reporting on a phenomenon they found sad and inexplicable, closed himself up tight after something happened, years back, and never opened back up again. When Eliza asked, gently, what had happened, Mrs. Garvey's expression did something complicated, and she said only that it involved a woman named Clara and a man who had been Elias' closest friend, and that it had ended in a betrayal so complete that the town had talked of little else for 2 seasons, and that whatever Elias Langston had been before that moment, he had been something different and harder and more contained afterward. Eliza thought about that for a long time that night, sitting by her fire in the little house she had by then made mostly habitable, and she recognized in that description a kind of damage she understood from the inside. The way a fundamental betrayal doesn't just hurt you but restructures you. The way it closes off the parts of yourself you used to offer freely, because offering them led to the worst thing you'd experienced, and your whole body learns that lesson even when your mind knows it's overcautious. She understood Cornelius Hatch and what he'd done to her understanding of herself, in ways she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. She understood the logic of building walls. She understood the appeal of a life where you didn't give anyone the leverage to hurt you that way again. What she hadn't yet decided was whether that logic was wisdom or cowardice, and she suspected it was different on different days. She began working her land in earnest through October. She had enough savings to purchase 4 milking cows from a farm north of town, a small flock of chickens, seed for a spring kitchen garden, and the materials to reinforce the barn that sat on the western edge of her property. She was not a farmer by training, but she had grown up watching her aunt keep a substantial kitchen garden in Richmond, and she had the kind of practical intelligence that absorbed useful information and converted it into action without requiring a great deal of ceremony. She learned from Mrs. Garvey, from Hector when he occasionally rode by, from the mercantile owner Briggs, who turned out to be a font of agricultural knowledge, once he warmed to a subject. She did not ask Elias Langston for anything, and he did not offer, but he was present in the particular way that a significant neighboring property makes its owner present. She saw him occasionally at a distance, riding the fence line. She encountered him twice at the mercantile, where they exchanged 2 or 3 sentences of practical information and went their separate ways. She sat 3 pews behind him at Sunday services, which he attended with the regularity of a man honoring an obligation rather than a man finding comfort, and she watched the back of his gray hat and thought about what Mrs. Garvey had told her. The first real conversation they had, not a transaction, not a boundary dispute, but an actual conversation, happened by accident on an afternoon in mid-October when her best milking cow, a red-and-white animal she had named Margaret in honor of an aunt she'd liked considerably better than Dorothea, escaped through a gap in the fence and wandered onto Langston land, apparently seeking adventure. Eliza found her, eventually, 3/4 of a mile south of the property line, placidly grazing in a depression of good grass while 2 of Langston's cowboys stood nearby, clearly uncertain what to do with her. Elias Langston arrived about 5 minutes after Eliza did, having been summoned by one of the cowboys, and found Eliza in the process of attaching a lead rope to Margaret's halter with the efficient movements of someone who has recently learned to do a thing and is not yet fully comfortable with it but is determined to manage. "She's mine," Eliza said before he could speak. "I apologize for the intrusion. The gap in the fence will be repaired today." "I know she's yours," he said. He was watching her handle the rope with an expression that was neither critical nor amused, but was something in between, something that might have been attentive. "Do you need help getting her back?" "I have her," Eliza said, and demonstrated this by leading Margaret forward. Margaret took 2 steps, stopped, and applied the full weight of her bovine stubbornness to the question of whether she would be returning north. A silence. "She wants the grass," Elias said. "I can see that. If you angle her north and walk without hesitation, she'll follow your authority. Give her any uncertainty and she'll use it." Eliza considered this, then did exactly what he suggested. Margaret, apparently respecting decisiveness, followed her north at a reasonable pace. When she glanced back, Elias Langston was watching her go, and there was something on his face that took her a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar in context. It looked like he was trying not to smile. It was the beginning of November when the thing happened that Eliza had not told anyone about, had not expected to tell anyone about, and found herself telling Elias Langston about on a cold Tuesday morning that neither of them had planned. She had gone to the land office in Millhaven to file a paper regarding her property survey, a routine errand, and had come back to find a man named Delbert Prout sitting on her porch step. Prout was a land broker from San Antonio, wide and smooth-faced and wearing clothes that were more expensive than his manner, and he had a way of smiling that was entirely disconnected from his eyes. He told her, with enormous friendliness, that he represented a cattle syndicate that was very interested in the 63 acres she owned, and that they were prepared to offer her a price well above the land's current assessed value, and that she would find their terms very reasonable, and that a woman alone managing a small operation without the benefit of experience or capital really ought to consider what an intelligent decision this would be. The word "ought" was what did it. Eliza had learned to identify the particular deployment of "ought" as a signal of what was coming next, and what came next was Prout explaining, with the smooth relentlessness of a man who had delivered this speech many times, that the syndicate he represented had certain relationships with county officials, and that a property with boundary irregularities, he mentioned the fence adjustment, might be vulnerable to formal legal challenges that could become quite costly and complicated, and that taking their offer now would be so much simpler for everyone. It was a veiled threat. It was a trap. It was the precise sort of thing that Cornelius Hatch had done to her, not with land but with her reputation and her employment, when she'd broken their engagement. He'd threatened to tell the school board things about her that were not true, and she had called his bluff, and he'd done it, and she'd lost her position for 6 months before the truth had sorted itself out. She knew what it looked like when a man used institutional power as a lever to force her compliance. She told Prout to get off her porch. He did not get off her porch. She told him again, and he stood up and stepped closer, and she was deciding what she was going to do about that when Boots came up the steps behind him and Elias Langston, who had apparently arrived to discuss the boundary survey timing with Hector, and found a different situation entirely on the neighboring property, put his hand on Prout's shoulder in a grip that was controlled and quiet and absolute. "The lady asked you to leave," Elias said. His voice had no heat in it whatsoever, which made it considerably more alarming than heat would have been. Prout left. Eliza sat down on her porch step, which was embarrassing, but her legs had made the decision without her, and she respected the information they were conveying, which was that she had been more frightened than she'd let herself realize. Elias sat down beside her, at a distance that was careful and respectful, and said nothing for long enough that she felt the shaking in her hands begin to subside. "He said the syndicate has relationships with county officials," she finally said. "Prout said that to half the small landowners between here and Laredo," Elias said. "He's bought 2 of them out that way. The relationships he's talking about are thinner than he implies. The county judge is a fair man. Do you know him, the judge?" "Reasonably well." A pause. "He owes me a favor I've never collected. I'd call it in for this." Eliza turned her head and looked at him. His profile was very still, his eyes on the middle distance. She said, "Why would you do that?" He seemed to consider this with genuine thoughtfulness, as though the question deserved a real answer and he was going to give it one. "Because you fixed your own porch step," he said. "And you moved a cow through cow stubbornness by yourself. And you didn't scream at Prout or collapse or start offering concessions the moment he talked about legal trouble. And because what Prout does is wrong and I have the ability to interfere with it, and not interfering when you have the ability makes you part of it. It was the longest speech she had heard from him. It was also, she thought, the most honest account of a man's reasoning she had received in some time. "I'll handle my own legal situation," she said, "but I'd appreciate an introduction to the judge if you're willing to provide one." "Thursday," he said, and stood up. "I'll take you to his office Thursday morning." He went to find Hector and discussed the survey timing, and Eliza sat on her porch for a while longer and looked at the creek, and thought that she had made a mistake in the assessment she'd built of Elias Langston, or rather that the assessment was accurate but incomplete, like a map that shows the roads correctly but leaves out the river. Thursday came, and they walked to the county judge's office together, which was the first time they had been in each other's company in a context that had no transactional purpose, and the strangeness of that, the absence of purpose, made the walk very quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable but was unexpectedly charged. She was aware of him in a way she had been trying not to be since mid-October, a specific, particularized awareness of how he moved and where he was and what he was about to say before he said it. The judge was a spare, white-haired man named Aldous Fitch who listened to Eliza describe Prout's visit with the focused attention of a man who takes things seriously, and then looked at Elias over the rim of his reading glasses and said, "Langston." "Fitch," Elias said. "That favor?" "Yes." Fitch nodded slowly. "I'll write letters," he said, "to the county assessor and the circuit court recorder. If Prout's syndicate tries to manufacture a challenge to Miss Sutton's title, they'll find the foundation considerably less cooperative than they anticipated." "Thank you," Eliza said. Fitch looked at her with the kind of appraisal that is respectful rather than intrusive. "You're Dorothea Sutton's niece," he said. "I am. Your aunt was a remarkable woman. Sent me a letter once, years back, regarding a case I was deciding. Persuaded me to a position I'd been uncertain of. She was right, as it turned out." He paused. "You have the same eyes, same quality of attention." Eliza left the judge's office feeling something she hadn't felt since before Cornelius Hatch, which was the particular warmth of a place beginning to feel like it might become home. She said, walking back, "Thank you for the introduction, and for Thursday." "I told you Thursday," he said. "I was here." It was such a plain, straightforward thing to say, and it struck her with a force entirely disproportionate to its simplicity, because what he was saying underneath the words was that he kept his commitments. That was all. But she had recently lived through the experience of learning that this was not universal, and the specificity of it made her chest ache in a way she couldn't entirely attribute to November cold. They parted at the corner of Main Street, and she walked back to her property, and spent the evening patching a gap in her chicken wire, and trying very hard not to think about Elias Langston's voice when he'd said I was here. The first real fight they had, because they were going to have one, and she had known it was coming, could feel it building in the particular tension of two strong-willed people in close orbit, happened in late November, about a water right. The creek that ran behind her property fed eventually into a tributary that crossed the southern edge of the Langston Ranch. She had begun drawing water from the creek for her livestock, which was well within her rights, but she had also, because she was practical and thinking ahead, begun to dam a small section of the creek to create a watering pond that would serve better in dry months. The dam, small as it was, slightly reduced the flow of water crossing onto Langston land. Elias rode up on a Friday morning and addressed this without ceremony. "The creek water," he said, "you're reducing the flow. By approximately 10%, she said, she had measured, which is within the legal allowance for a riparian property holder. In a dry year, 10% of that creek is the difference between my south pasture cattle having enough water in August and not having enough. And in a dry year, my livestock having no reliable water source is the difference between maintaining my herd and losing it. I need the pond. There are other ways to create a water reserve that are more expensive and less reliable," she said. "I've looked at them." A silence. He was looking at her with that flat, thunderhead quality, and she recognized now that it didn't mean what she'd initially thought it meant, not coldness, not calculation, but the concentrated effort of a man who is taking something seriously. "I could dig you a well," he said, "on the north side of your property. My men have the equipment. It would serve you better than the pond." "That's not a trade I'm asking for. I'm not offering it as a trade. I'm offering it as a solution." "Why?" she said, and the word came out sharper than she intended because underneath it was the thing she was actually asking, which was, why do you keep doing things like this? Why do you keep making decisions about what's good for me without asking if I want your solution? And is this genuine, or is it another version of what men always do, which is give you something in order to take something else? He heard the real question. She could see that he did, because something in his face shifted, and what replaced the calculation was something that looked very much like hurt, quickly controlled. "Because the creek water matters to my operation," he said, "and because you need a reliable water source. And because a well serves both those things simultaneously, that's the whole of it." She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the hidden motive, the trap, the thing underneath the thing. She found, to her own discomfort, nothing she could point to. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for a week, which was how long it took her to find the thing she'd been looking for. Not the hidden motive, but the source of her reflexive search for one: Cornelius Hatch. She had learned from him to suspect generosity. That was the longest-lasting damage he'd done her. Not the lost position or the humiliation, but the rewiring of her instinct to receive kindness as warning. She found Elias at the fence line on a cold Thursday afternoon. "If the offer for the well is still open," she said, "I'd like to accept it." He looked at her. He said, "It's still open." "I want to be clear," she said, "that I'm accepting because it's a genuinely good solution for the land and the water situation, not because I need your help." "I know," he said, "and I'm paying for the well." "Half," he said. She thought about it. "Half," she agreed. The well was dug over the course of 3 days in early December by Hector and 2 other Langston hands, and Eliza cooked them a hot meal each evening as a form of thanks that was also, she was aware, a form of participation that kept her from feeling like she was simply receiving. On the 3rd evening, after the other men had gone, Elias stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee at her kitchen table, the first time he had been inside the house, and looked around at what she had done with it. The curtains she'd sewn from fabric she'd bought at the mercantile, the bookshelves she'd built from spare lumber, the row of her aunt's books that had made the journey in the trunk. "You've made it habitable," he said. "I've made it a home," she said, because there was a difference and it mattered to her. He looked at her. And then he did something that surprised her more than she would have predicted, which was that he asked her about the books, what they were, which ones she'd read more than once, whether any of them were the kind that were worth reading in Texas. She told him about them, and he listened with the full, unhurried attention of a man who was not performing interest but was actually interested, and they talked for an hour about books in a way that she had not talked with anyone since leaving Richmond. And when he finally stood to go, he stood for a moment in the doorway and said, "I haven't read a book in 4 years." "Why not?" she said. A pause. "Didn't see the point," he said, "of anything that wasn't work." She didn't say anything. She held his gaze until he looked away, and then he said good night and walked out into the December dark. And she shut her door and pressed her back against it and acknowledged to herself, alone in her own kitchen, that she was in a significant amount of trouble. December was cold and dry and intensely beautiful in the way of West Texas winter. The sky, a hard, clear blue that went all the way to the edge of the world. And Eliza worked her land and kept her routine, and tried to keep her feelings in their proper compartments, which was a project of limited success. She could feel what was happening, and she was afraid of it in the specific, familiar way of someone who has been badly burned. Not afraid of him, exactly. Afraid of herself. Afraid of what it would mean to want something that she had already demonstrated she could get catastrophically wrong. Afraid of the particular vulnerability of caring about a person whose interior life was largely opaque and who had, by all accounts, closed himself to the prospect of care returned. She thought about Clara, about the betrayal Mrs. Garvey had described. She tried to imagine what it had done to him, to be destroyed by someone he'd trusted completely, and she found she could imagine it very well, which was not comforting. He had built an entire life on the principle of not needing anyone. She could see it in everything, in the self-sufficiency of the Langston operation, in the way he managed every detail personally, in the careful distance he maintained from the town despite living adjacent to it for years. She understood that architecture of self-protection. She had been building her own version of it for 2 years. The difference, she supposed, was that she was aware of it as architecture, as something constructed from necessity rather than something that was simply the truth of who she was. She didn't know if Elias Langston had that awareness. She didn't know if she had any business trying to find out. Christmas in Millhaven was a modest affair of pine boughs and church services, and a small community supper organized by the Presbyterian ladies. Eliza attended. Elias Langston attended. They sat, by the random mechanics of social seating, at the same long table, which put him 4 people to her right and across from her by 2, near enough that she could hear his voice when he spoke, and far enough that she did not have to manage her own expression every moment. She observed him in company and found him consistent with her private experience of him, sparing of speech, attentive to what other people said, occasionally precise and unexpectedly direct when he did contribute, not unkind but with the quality of a man who has nothing left over for charm and has decided this is not his problem. After supper, when people were moving about with their coffee and their conversation, he appeared beside her near the door. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said, a brief silence. "Your land is looking managed," he said, which from Elias Langston she was learning to read as a considerable compliment. "Thank you." "Your fence repair is looking very straight." He almost smiled. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, the almost. "I wanted to say," he began and stopped. She waited. She had learned that waiting was the correct response when he started a sentence and stopped it. "I wanted to say that I'm glad you stayed," he said. "Prout's offered similar arrangements to other small landholders and some of them have taken it and left. I'm glad you didn't." "Why?" she said, and this time the question was not sharp. It was quiet and genuine, and she held his gaze while she asked it. He looked at her for what felt like a long time, though it was probably 10 seconds. "Because you belong here," he said. "The land suits you. You suit the land." He went to get his coat and hat, and Eliza stood by the door of the church social hall and felt the words settle into her like warmth into cold stone, slow and deep and fundamentally altering. January came, and with it a cold snap that turned the creek behind her house to a strip of dark glass, and tested every repair she'd made to the house since arriving. The chickens were less happy about the cold than the cows were, and she spent a good portion of a January afternoon engineering a better windbreak for the henhouse using cedar branches and her own pragmatic ingenuity. It was during this project that Hector rode by and stopped, and they talked over the fence for a while, and he told her something about Elias that she had not known. He told her about the night Elias had bought his father's debts. Harlan Teague, the land broker Eliza knew slightly from her own property transaction, had held the notes on the Langston land, and when Elias' father died, Teague had moved to foreclose. Elias had been 22 years old and had ridden to Teague's office alone and put $1,200 cash, every dollar he'd saved in 4 years of cowhand wages, on the desk, and said simply that he was buying the notes, and that if Teague had any objection he was prepared to discuss it. Teague had had no objection. He'd taken the money and handed over the notes, and Elias had walked out of that office with his father's land and 43 cents left in his pocket. "He's never told anyone that story," Hector said, "but I was there. I drove the wagon." A pause. He was 22 years old and his hands were shaking, but his voice was not. Eliza thought about 22-year-old Elias Langston with his shaking hands and his still voice, facing down a debt that could have consumed him, and she felt something in her chest move like ice breaking on a spring river. The letters began in February. This was not a deliberate strategy on either side. It happened as a consequence of practicality. She needed information about the spring planting timetable in relation to the water availability from the well, and rather than ride to his operation, she wrote him a brief note and sent it with Hector. He wrote back. His handwriting was angular and precise, and his letters, like his speech, were stripped of ornament. But the information they contained was dense and useful, and occasionally contained a sentence that was not quite practical, that existed for some other reason she found difficult to name. She wrote back to those sentences. She wrote about things that were not entirely practical. She wrote about the book she was reading by lamplight, about Margaret's latest attempt to find additional freedom, about the way the winter light looked on the lawn o' Estacado in the late afternoon when the grass turned to the color of old gold. He wrote back about those things too. She kept his letters in the top drawer of her bedside table and did not examine too closely what that meant. March came with a crisis that she had not anticipated. 2 of her cows were sick. She recognized the symptoms from a conversation she'd had with Briggs about cattle disease, and it was serious enough that she sent for the veterinarian in the neighboring town of Crockett, who was 3 days away, and in the meantime did everything she knew to do, which was not enough. She was in the barn at 2 in the morning with a lantern and her 3rd cup of coffee and a level of genuine fear for the animals. She had named them, Margaret and Ruth and Esther, and a brown one she'd called simply Brown for lack of further inspiration, when she heard boots on the barn floor and turned to find Elias Langston carrying a supply case. She stared at him. He looked at the 2 sick cows, set down the supply case and said, "Hector told me this afternoon. I've dealt with this illness before." "It's past midnight," she said. "The animals don't know that," he said. They worked side by side for 4 hours, he directing and she assisting and occasionally reversing those positions when his angles were difficult and hers were better. He knew what he was doing with a depth of practical knowledge that expressed itself not in explanation but in action, and she trusted it, which she noticed with a kind of mild shock. She was not a woman who trusted easily, and she had not expected to find herself trusting a man's judgment about an immediate crisis this completely after 3 months of association. Ruth and Esther both survived the night, and by the time the cold gray light of March dawn came through the barn's eastern window they were stable, and Eliza and Elias were sitting against the barn wall on the hay with the supply case between them like a small table, both of them exhausted. She said, "How did you know? When your father died and you had to make the decision about the land, how did you know it was the right thing to do?" He looked at her. The tiredness on his face made him look younger, she thought. More like himself. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew the alternative was worse. Losing the land." Losing the land meant losing the only thing that was still itself after everything else went wrong. A pause. "My father was not a good manager. He was not a terrible man, but he was not a good manager, and the land suffered for it while he was alive. When he died, I thought about what the land could be if someone managed it properly, and I thought that that person could be me, and I didn't want anyone else to have the chance to do what I could do with it." He paused. "That sounds arrogant." "It sounds honest," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Clara told me I was arrogant. It was one of the last things she said to me." The name landed between them like a stone into still water. Eliza waited. "She and I had an understanding," he said, and his voice was level in the way that levelness is maintained by effort. "For 2 years, I thought it was one thing. It turned out to be another. She was promised to my friend Robert before she and I began. I didn't know that. Robert did." A pause. "He let it continue because it suited him. She let it continue because she wanted things from me that she couldn't get from Robert, and then when she had them she went back to him and they married the following spring." "She used you," Eliza said, not a question. "She deceived me. Robert deceived me. And I spent a significant amount of time afterward trying to determine which was worse, being lied to or having believed it." He was quiet for a moment. "I decided believing it was worse, so I stopped believing things." "Things or people?" He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "A considerable one," she said gently. "You stopped trusting people's honesty. You mistook that for not trusting anything. But you clearly trust the land, you trust work, you trust practical evidence." She paused. "You trusted the fence markers when I showed them to you, even though they worked against your interests. You trust Hector. You trusted Judge Fitch enough to call in a favor for someone you'd known 2 months." He was very still. "You've been trusting selectively the whole time," she said. "You're just afraid to notice it." A long silence. "You're a very dangerous woman," he said, and his voice was low and did not entirely sound like he meant it as a warning. "I've been told I'm direct," she said. "That's an understatement." She looked at him, sitting against the barn wall in the dawn light of her barn, exhausted and unguarded in a way she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be. And she felt the full weight of what she felt for him settle into her like something permanent. It was frightening and clarifying simultaneously, the way significant truths tend to be. She did not say it. She was direct, but she was not reckless, and she was not sure yet what she had to offer and whether offering it would be wisdom or the same mistake in different clothes. She said, "Thank you for coming tonight." He nodded. He stood and helped her to her feet, and they were briefly closer than they'd ever been. Close enough that she could see the gray in his hair at the temples and the particular quality of exhaustion in his eyes, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved. Then he stepped back and said he would check in the afternoon, and left. She stood in the barn for a while after he'd gone and talked to the cows, who listened with the patient attention of animals who have recently received excellent care and feel broadly positive about the humans responsible for it. Spring came, and with it the kind of renewal that the Texas Hill Country delivers with extravagant generosity, the range going green almost overnight, the creek running full and musical, the garden Eliza had planted in March beginning to push confident rows of growth through the dark soil. She was happy in a way she had not expected to be happy. Working, managing, building something that was hers in the most fundamental sense of that word. She had written to 2 friends in Richmond and described her life here, and reading the letters back she had recognized that they did not sound like the letters of a woman in exile. They sounded like someone who had found the shape that fit her. Elias came by more frequently in April, with practical reasons that she could see were genuine and also noticed were more numerous than strictly necessary. He brought information about spring planting conditions. He brought news of an upcoming county fair that she might find useful for selling any surplus she produced. He brought once a book from his own shelf. She had not known he had one that he pressed into her hand without explanation, a worn copy of Thoreau that had annotations in the margins in a handwriting she didn't recognize as his. "Your father's," she said. "Mine," he said. "From before." She read it carefully and gave it back to him 2 weeks later with a note that said simply, "I understand why you kept this one." He kept the note. She knew because Hector told her, and then immediately looked guilty about telling her, and she made a face at him that she hoped conveyed that she was not displeasured by the information. The county fair was held in late April, and Eliza attended with 4 jars of jam she'd made from the wild plums along the creek bank, and an egg display that won second prize from the Presbyterian Ladies' Committee, which she accepted with appropriate modesty and genuine delight. She watched a roping competition that featured several Langston cowboys, and she watched Elias Langston watch his men work with the particular concentrated approval of a man who has invested significant effort in training people and is satisfied by the result. After the competition, she found herself beside him at the lemonade table, both of them holding paper cups, watching the fair's social machinations with the mild, detached interest of 2 people who are there together without having officially come together. "Second prize," he said. "The Baptist ladies had an extraordinary entry," she said. "I was outmatched." "You were not outmatched. The judges have a preference." "Are you defending my eggs to me?" "I'm observing that the judging was not objective." She looked at him with what she suspected was a rather too warm expression and said, "That is very kind of you. I'm being accurate." "Accuracy and kindness are not mutually exclusive," she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said, "I suppose they're not." They stood there in the April afternoon sun drinking lemonade and saying very little and being, she thought, remarkably comfortable with each other in a way that had no specific origin point she could identify, that had just accumulated over the months like layers of fine sediment until it had become something solid. May was when she made the mistake. Or what she thought in the first 24 hours was a mistake. What turned out by the end of the second 24 hours to be the thing that broke open the careful, patient, mutually observed distance they had both been maintaining with impressive discipline for 6 months. She had been in the mercantile, and she had overheard a conversation she was not meant to overhear between two Langston cowboys who were buying supplies and had not noticed her in the back aisle examining seed packets. They were talking about a woman named Adele, who was, it emerged from context, a woman in the town of Crockett who apparently had some kind of long-standing interest in Elias Langston, and who had, according to the cowboys, been corresponding with him, and who was, according to the more talkative of the two cowboys, almost certainly going to be coming to Millhaven in June for a visit that had been in discussion since winter. Eliza walked home from the mercantile very carefully, in the measured way of someone managing their own interior weather, and she spent the evening in a state of quiet, thorough turmoil that she recognized as the specific shape of jealousy, which she had not felt in this form before and found she intensely disliked. She also recognized the particular architecture of her jealousy, which was not simply "I want him," but was also "I was wrong." He is not closed. He has simply been open in a different direction, toward someone else. And the months of letters and the midnight barn and the book with the pencil marginalia were not what I thought they were. And I have managed to do this again, to misread a situation, to mistake the ordinary goodwill of a fair man for something specific and particular. She did not allow herself to cry, because she was 26 years old and had survived worse, and she had a well-built house and 63 acres, and a herd of cows who depended on her, and she was not going to be undone by a conversation she'd overheard in a seed aisle. But she was very quiet for 2 days, and apparently this was noticeable because on the third day Elias rode to her fence line and called her out from the garden with an expression that was close to the surface, that had none of its usual careful distance. "What happened?" he said, not a question. "Nothing happened," she said. "You look the way people look when something happened." "I'm in the middle of planting," she said. "I've composted soil on my hands. If I look any particular way, it's because gardening is demanding." Eliza. It was the first time he had used only her first name, and it hit her precisely in the center of her chest. She straightened from the garden bed and looked at him. She said, "I heard your men talking in the mercantile about a woman named Adele in Crockett." A silence. "They said she's coming to visit in June," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of her voice. "I see," he said. "I don't have any. I'm not claiming any." She stopped, because she was on the verge of saying something that managed to be simultaneously too much and not enough. She took a breath. "I realize I have no standing to have an opinion about your personal arrangements," she said, "and I apologize for behaving in a way that apparently communicated something that was not my intention." "What was your intention?" he said. "To manage my own feelings privately without burdening you with them." "And what are your feelings?" She looked at him. At the gray hat and the duster and the eyes that were not flat anymore, not thunderheads, but something more charged than that, something that was looking at her with a directness she had not seen from him in quite this form before. "That's not a fair question," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm asking it." She made a decision. She was Eliza Sutton, and she had come to Texas to build something real, and she had decided sometime in the past several months that real things required honesty, even when honesty was terrifying. "My feelings," she said steadily, "are that I have been an absolute fool about you since approximately October, and I have been trying to talk myself out of it on grounds of practicality and self-preservation, and I have been entirely unsuccessful. And I would appreciate very much knowing whether the woman in Crockett matters to you in the way that I think I have come to matter to you. Because if she does, I would like to adjust my plans accordingly, and I would like to do it before I embarrass us both further. The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever experienced. Then Elias Langston dismounted, dropped his mare's reins, and came to the fence. Adele is a woman I corresponded with twice, last autumn, at the suggestion of her brother who thought we might be a match, he said. His voice was very low and very even. I wrote to her in October and once in November, and she wrote back twice, and I did not write again because by November I had found that I had nothing to say to her because everything I had to say I was saying to someone who was considerably closer to my fence line. Eliza said nothing. She may be planning to come to Millhaven, he continued. That is her prerogative, but she is not coming at my invitation, and she is not coming with any expectation I have created. He was very close to the fence now. I should have written and told her directly that the correspondence was not continuing. That was a failure of honesty that was cowardice, and I'm not proud of it. He put his hand on the fence post. He was close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. Eliza, he said, I have not known what to do with what I feel about you since the day you told me my fence was in the wrong place and turned out to be correct. I have not known how to offer it without being certain it was wanted. Because the last time I offered it to someone and was wrong, it cost me things I can't entirely name, and he stopped. His jaw was set. I was afraid. So was I, she said. They looked at each other through the fence, 5 inches of wooden post and air between them, and Eliza thought that she had crossed more difficult ground than this and come through it, and that the specific fear of reaching toward something you want is the only fear worth being afraid of, because the alternative is a life built of protective distance, and she was done with that. She put her hand over his on the fence post. His hand turned under hers and held on. He wrote to Adele the following week. A letter that she gathered from context was honest and direct and kind in its closure. He told Eliza he had written it, and she nodded, and they let it be what it was. Summer in Texas is not a gentle season. It arrived in late May and immediately began expressing itself with the full force of its character, the heat turning the air above the rangeland to something that wavered and danced, the sky going white-blue with the effort of containing all that light. Eliza worked her garden in the mornings and the evenings and did other tasks in the shade of the midday, and Elias rode by in the late afternoons with increasing frequency and increasingly transparent reasons. They went for rides together on summer evenings, she on a roan mare she had finally been able to purchase from a man in town who was reducing his stock, and he on his dark bay. The rangeland in the evening was extraordinary, the grass going gold and the sky going apricot and violet, and they rode side by side mostly in silence that was comfortable in the way of two people who have stopped needing to fill space with words because the space itself is satisfying. He kissed her for the first time on a June evening, on a rise of land that overlooked both their properties, the creek visible below as a dark ribbon through the gold grass. They had stopped to watch the sun go down, and he had turned to say something. She never knew what he'd intended to say and found her already looking at him, and the distance closed in a way that was both sudden and entirely inevitable, the way things are when they've been building for 8 months. It was careful, and then it was not. She had not kissed anyone since Cornelius Hatch, and the difference was so total she felt it in her bones. Not the technique of it, but the quality, the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. He pulled back and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before, something open and unguarded and slightly stunned, and she thought that was probably what she looked like too. I should have fixed that fence earlier, he said. She laughed, and the sound of it on the open range surprised her, clean and genuine, and he looked at the sound of it with something in his face that she could only describe as reverence. The summer deepened, and their life together deepened with it, in the unhurried way of two people who have both been hurt and are rebuilding not from impatience, but from genuine desire. He invited her to the Langston ranch house for supper for the first time in late June, and she saw for the first time the extent of what he had built and the nature of what he lived with, a house that was large and well-made and practically organized, and that had almost no warmth in it, no softness, nothing that spoke of personal life or care for comfort, as though it had been built by and for someone who considered warmth a luxury he had canceled along with other unnecessary expenditures. She did not say this, but she looked at his kitchen, and she looked at his sitting room, and she looked at the walls that had no pictures and the shelves that had 6 books and a great deal of empty space, and she thought about the house she had made on her 63 acres and what it had taken to make it feel like a home, and she thought that whatever came next for them, this house was going to need some attention. She brought him a picture for the wall on her next visit, a small framed print she'd found at the back of her trunk, a landscape of mountains that she'd bought in Richmond for reasons she'd never been entirely certain of, but that now felt perfectly explicable. He hung it in the sitting room immediately, without discussion, with the focused care of a man who takes the things he's given seriously. She came home that evening and sat by the fire and looked at her own walls and at the pictures she'd put there, and thought about the logistics of combining 2 lives that were each separately rooted in their own land. And she did not have an answer yet, but she was not afraid of not having one, which seemed like progress. July brought a complication in the form of Delbert Prout, who returned to Millhaven with what turned out to be a partner and a more aggressive approach. He arrived this time with a legal document prepared by a San Antonio attorney that claimed a competing title to 3 acres of Eliza's property based on an alleged error in the original survey conducted before Eliza Sutton's acquisition. It was a manufactured claim. She was nearly certain, but manufactured claims required genuine legal defense, and the cost of that defense was real. She told Elias. He was at her kitchen table, and his expression while she described it went through several things very quickly, settling on controlled and focused. "Judge Fitch," he said. "I've already written to him," she said, "and I've written to an attorney in Austin who handled land disputes. But it takes time and it takes money, and Prout knows that. I can," he began. "No," she said. "This is my land, my fight. What I need from you is information. Do you know anyone in San Antonio who knows the attorney Prout is using?" He thought for a moment. "Teague," he said. "Harlan Teague does business in San Antonio. He knows that legal community." Eliza's opinion of Harlan Teague was mixed, given that he was the man who had held her land's notes before Dorothea bought the property. But Elias sent word to Teague, who proved unexpectedly willing to be useful, apparently motivated by the fact that the same syndicate Prout represented had previously made aggressive moves on Teague's own business. The enemy of one's enemy in 1878 Texas was sometimes the only ally available. Teague provided information about the San Antonio attorney that proved, when passed to Eliza's Austin attorney, extremely useful. The manufactured claim was challenged with documented evidence of the original survey's legitimacy, and within 3 weeks it had been formally dismissed by the Circuit Court Recorder's office. Prout left Millhaven that same week and was not, to anyone's knowledge, seen in the county again. Eliza, closing the letter from her attorney that confirmed the dismissal, felt something clean and complete settle in her chest. The land was hers. Unambiguously, legally, permanently hers. Nobody could take it with a legal threat dressed up as paperwork. She went to Elias that afternoon and told him, and he looked at her with the expression she had learned to love best, the one that was not quite a smile but was everything a smile contained, and she stepped up and kissed him in the ranch yard in front of Hector, who looked at the sky with dignified discretion, and immediately found that a fence in the north pasture required his urgent attention. August was when he asked her to marry him, and he did it with characteristic directness and without ceremony, at the fence line between their properties on a late afternoon when the golden light was doing its extravagant best across the rangeland. "I want us to be permanent," he said. "I want to stop having a reason to ride to your fence line and to just ride to you. I want your books on my shelves and your opinions in my house, and whatever you want to build for yourself to be built with the understanding that I'll be there when you want me and not underfoot when you don't." He paused. "I'm not good at this. I don't have the language for it." "You have exactly the right language," she said. "It just sounds like yourself." "Is that a yes?" "That's very definitely a yes," she said. He took her hand over the fence post, and she laughed at the symbolism of that, and he looked at the laugh with the reverence she loved, and she thought that this was the shape of it. This exactly two people who had both learned the hard way that trust is not naivete but choice, choosing each other across a fence line. They were married in October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Eliza had arrived in Millhaven with her enormous trunk on the day of the mud and the rain. Married by the Presbyterian minister, in a service attended by what appeared to be most of the county, because apparently the story of Elias Langston's 11,000 acres meeting Eliza Sutton's 63 was the kind of story that people felt they had witnessed the making of and wanted to be present for the official conclusion of. Mrs. Garvey cried. Judge Fitch attended. Hector stood beside Elias with the composed dignity of a man who has waited a long time to see his employer make the right decision and is deeply satisfied that the moment has arrived. Briggs from the Mercantile sat in the third row and applauded at appropriate and some technically inappropriate moments. And after the ceremony, walking out of the church in the October afternoon, Eliza tucked her hand into the crook of Elias' arm and looked out at the town of Millhaven and felt the particular completeness of a person who has arrived, finally, at the place they were always moving toward without knowing it. "Are we going to keep both properties?" she said. It was a practical question. It was also not only a practical question. "Your land is yours," he said without hesitation. "We'll manage both. The creek water situation is already solved and the fence line is already right." He paused. "We can decide later what to do with the houses." She thought about her little house with its curtains and its bookshelves and its garden, and she thought about his large house with its one picture on the wall and its empty shelves, and she said, "I think we should live in yours and make it ours. And keep mine maintained for whatever it turns out to be needed for." "That's reasonable," he said. "Most things I suggest are." He made the sound that was his version of laughing, a low exhale of genuine amusement, and she had come to love this sound with a specificity that she suspected she would not be able to explain to anyone who hadn't heard it. The first winter of their marriage was a season of adjustment and revelation, as all first winters of marriages are. She moved her books to his shelves, and they occupied the space with the comfortable authority of things that have found their proper location. She brought her aunt's 2 best quilts, and they went onto the bed in a way that made the room feel immediately different. She brought a second picture, and then a third, and he hung them himself with the same focused care he'd given to the first. He, in turn, made adjustments of his own. He was not accustomed to sharing a house, and the early weeks had some friction in them. He had strong opinions about where tools should be kept, and she had strong opinions about the management of the kitchen, and they discovered their opinions differed on several things and were identical on others in ways that were simultaneously inconvenient and clarifying. They argued twice, with genuine heat, and resolved both arguments with the particular thoroughness of 2 people who are committed enough to go all the way through a thing rather than stopping at a comfortable surface. He told her in December about Clara. All of it, not the abbreviated version she'd heard in the barn, but the whole thing, and she listened without interruption and said when he was finished that what Clara and Robert had done was a genuine betrayal and he was right to name it that, and also that it was behind him now and she was not Clara and she would not become her. "I know," he said. "I've known that for a long time." "How long?" she said. A pause. "The day you moved the cow." She looked at him. You decided to trust me based on watching me lead a stubborn cow. It was the quality of the decision-making," he said seriously. "The way you corrected for the cow's stubbornness without fighting it. People who know how to work with the nature of a thing rather than against it tend to be honest." She thought about this. "That is an extremely specific criterion for trust," she said. "It served me reasonably well," he said. She kissed him for being exactly himself, which she was finding was consistently a reliable motivation. February brought what they had hoped for and not spoken of too directly, which was the news that Eliza was expecting. She told him on a cold morning in the kitchen over coffee directly, because she was Eliza Sutton Langston, and she did not approach significant information with ceremony or evasion, and he sat very still for a moment, and then looked at her with an expression that was entirely new, that she had not catalogued yet, that was somewhere between overwhelmed and the most fundamental gratitude she had ever seen on a human face. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said I should fix the third bedroom, Elias. The window latch is sticking, and the floor has a soft board near the east wall. Elias. He looked at her. His eyes were very bright. "We're having a baby," she said gently. "Yes," he said, "we are." And he reached across the table and took her hand and held it with the steadiness of a man who has something he intends to keep. He fixed the bedroom window and the floor within the week. He also, she noticed, began reading books again, working through her shelves with the focused attention of a man who has decided that the world contains things worth understanding, and he has time for them now. He asked her questions about what she read, and they talked about the books in the evenings by the fire, and she thought that this was one of her favorite things about being married to him. That conversation with him was never performative, was always actual, was always the real thing under any particular topic. The spring of 1880 was one of the most beautiful she had seen in Texas, the rangeland going improbably green, the creek running high and clear, her garden coming up with the robust optimism of good soil well tended. She worked it carefully, modifying her approach as the months progressed, and her body made certain demands on her that she accommodated with the same pragmatic intelligence she applied to everything else. Elias hovered. He tried not to hover. He was largely unsuccessful at not hovering, but made a genuine and visible effort, which she found so endearing that she told him once that his hovering was welcome if he could contain it to a reasonable radius. And he apparently took this seriously, because after that he kept himself at approximately 12 feet when she was working outside, which was close enough to be present and far enough to leave her room to operate. Their son was born in September of 1880, delivered by Mrs. Garvey, who turned out to have midwifery experience dating back 30 years, and by a doctor from Crockett who arrived in adequate time. It was a hard labor, honest and long, and Elias spent most of it in the hallway of their bedroom with his back against the wall, and his hands pressed flat against his thighs in the posture of a man exercising every self-discipline he possessed. When Mrs. Garvey came out and told him he could come in, he went through the door and stood at the foot of the bed looking at Eliza, who was exhausted and very much herself, and the child she was holding, who was red-faced and furious about the world in the way of all new humans. Elias crossed to her and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child and then at her and said nothing for a moment. "He looks like he has opinions," he said finally. "I should hope so," Eliza said. "He comes from a family of people with opinions. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, and because it sounded like a name for a person who would make his own way. Hector rode over when he heard and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and said something in Spanish that Eliza didn't fully understand, but gathered from context was extremely positive. Mrs. Garvey came 3 times in the first week. Briggs from the mercantile sent a parcel of goods that was completely unnecessary and deeply appreciated. Judge Fitch sent a letter from town that was formal in structure and warm in substance, as his letters always were. The world outside their door continued being the world, which in West Texas in 1880 meant cattle prices and range conditions, and the ongoing negotiation of water rights and land use that was the texture of ranch life. And Elias managed it with the same focused competence he always had, with the difference that he came home now to something that hadn't been there before, which was people who needed him to come home, and the quality of his homecoming showed it. Thomas, at 6 months, was a large, determined baby with his father's gray eyes, and his mother's absolute refusal to accept a situation that was not working. He expressed this refusal with considerable volume, which Elias bore with a patience that he had apparently always possessed in relation to livestock, and was discovering extended to children, watching his son's frustrations with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely interested in the workings of a small mind. The following year, 1881, brought Elias' first full year of ranching with a family to come home to, and it changed things in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He brought Hector's family to a better house on the property, one that had been sitting empty, because Hector had a wife and 3 children, and the previous arrangement had been inadequate, and Elias had been aware of this without addressing it, and having a family himself had apparently recalibrated his sense of urgency on the matter. Eliza, when he told her he was doing this, looked at him with a warmth that he had learned to recognize as what she looked like when she was proud of him, and he found he valued it in a way that was not about validation, but about the recognition of shared values. Eliza's land continued to be managed as its own operation, with a hired man named Davis who proved reliable and hardworking, and who worked in communication with the Langston operation in the practical integration that good neighbors made possible. Her garden was the finest in the county by the 2nd year, and she sold surplus produce to the mercantile and to the boarding house and had begun, quietly, to be consulted by other small operation farmers in the area about soil management and crop rotation, which she delivered in the direct and specific way of someone who has learned by doing and respects the intelligence of her audience. She was building something. She could see its shape now, the shape of a life she had designed, not accepted, not fallen into, but actively chosen and constructed from the specific materials of her own character and judgment. It was not the life she'd have predicted from the Richmond parlor with the camphor smell, but it was entirely, recognizably hers. In the summer of 1882, she found the letter while going through a box of her aunt's papers that she had brought but not yet fully sorted. It was among papers relating to the land, and it was addressed to Dorothea in a hand she didn't recognize, and when she read it she understood something she had not known. The land. Dorothea had not simply acquired it. She had acquired it specifically because a woman named Langston had asked her to hold it, to keep it from being absorbed into a neighboring operation, until there was someone in the family who could make use of it. A woman named Eliza Langston, who had been the mother of Elias Langston. She read the letter 3 times. She held it for a long time. Then she put it down and thought about the geography of the thing. Her 63 acres, which had been held by her aunt for 15 years in a trust of friendship for a woman who had died when Elias was 19, which had passed to Eliza because she was the only one left to receive it, which had brought her to the fence line of the Langston land, which had brought her to Elias. The hidden architecture of how things come together. She showed him the letter that evening. He read it at the kitchen table with the careful attention he gave to anything important, and she watched him, and she saw the moment he understood, the slight stillness that crossed his face. "My mother," he said. "She knew your mother. My mother used to write letters," he said slowly. "She had correspondents. I didn't know who most of them were." He looked up from the letter. "She bought land. She asked my aunt to hold it," Eliza said. "I don't know why. Maybe she wanted to protect it. Maybe she was thinking about the future. Maybe she was protecting it from your father's debt, keeping it separate." Elias was quiet for a long time. He looked at the letter and then out the window at the rangeland in the July evening and then at Eliza. "She died when I was 19, he said. "Before any of the debt trouble, before I had to buy back what my father lost. A pause. She must have been thinking ahead. She must have been, Eliza said gently. She would have liked you, he said. She liked people who fixed their own porch steps. Eliza's eyes filled, which she managed with the same composed self-possession she managed most things, but she reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers. We were connected before we met, she said. We were, he said, although I'll allow that carrying your trunk had a more immediate effect. She looked at him. You've never explained that, she said. You've never told me why you did it on that first day. He considered. You were standing at the bottom of the hill, he said, with your jaw set and your hands flat and your spine as straight as a fence post in the rain, and you were obviously not going to ask anyone for help, and nobody was going to help you, and the trunk was going to sit there in the mud, and I thought that was wrong. Just wrong. And, he said, with the honesty that was so fundamental to him that it came out even when it might have been more comfortable to stop one sentence earlier, you had the most interesting face I'd seen in a very long time, and I wanted a reason to find out whose it was. She looked at him. That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, she said. Don't tell anyone, he said. My reputation. Your reputation is that you carried a strange woman's trunk up a muddy hill without being asked, she said. The town already has opinions about your romantic nature. He made the low exhale of genuine amusement, and she loved it, and the summer evening went on around them, golden and full of the sounds of the ranch and the creek, and the occasional distant announcement from Thomas's room where he was working on the art of getting to sleep. Their second child arrived in 1883, a girl they named Eleanor without any particular discussion required, because some names choose themselves. Eleanor had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady, assessing gray eyes, and she arrived in the world with considerably less drama than Thomas had, and immediately settled into the life of the household with the practical efficiency of someone who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Thomas, at 3, was deeply interested in horses and in his father's boots, and in the question of what was on the other side of every fence on the property. Elias, watching his son's investigative approach to the world, had an expression that Eliza had come to recognize as the one he wore when something struck him as both highly inconvenient and deeply satisfying simultaneously. He's going to find every gap in every fence on this property, Elias said. Like Margaret, Eliza said. Like his mother, Elias said. She considered this. I'll take that. The years settled into the particular rhythm of a life fully occupied, ranch seasons and their demands, the garden expanding as Eliza's knowledge of it deepened, children growing with the alarming speed of children, the community of Millhaven shifting around them as communities do, people arriving and departing, some things changing and some things remaining with the solidity of well-built structure. They had a third child in 1886, another boy they named James, who arrived with volume and enthusiasm and immediately established himself as a different kind of person than his siblings, louder and more social and deeply interested in the opinions of everyone around him. Hector's oldest son, Mateo, by then 16 and working on the ranch, took a particular shine to James and spent considerable time letting James follow him about, which Elias observed with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching the continuation of something he valued. In the spring of 1887, Briggs at the Mercantile retired and offered the store to anyone who wanted to take it over, and Eliza, who had been thinking for 2 years about the next thing she was going to build, sat down with Elias one evening and proposed that she buy the Mercantile and run it. He listened to her proposal with his full attention, asked 6 specific and intelligent questions about the financial plan, and said, "The land. Davis can continue managing it," she said. "With the well established and the operation stable, it doesn't need daily supervision, and if we hire a second hand, the management is covered." "The children," he said. "Children are 7, 4, and 1, she said. "Mrs. Garvey has offered to help with the youngest during the day, and Thomas is old enough for school and Eleanor will be in another year." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the flat, thunderhead quality she had learned meant he was taking something seriously. "This is what you want," he said. It was not precisely a question. "I want to build something of my own in this town," she said. "I love the land and I love the ranch and I love our life. And I want this too. I want something that's mine in a different way, that uses what I know about this community and what people need." A long pause. "Then do it," he said. "But I want to be involved in the accounting, not to supervise, because I'm good at it and it will be faster with two." She looked at him. "That's very reasonable," she said. "Most things I suggest are," he said. She bought the mercantile in May of 1887 and spent 2 weeks reorganizing it according to a logic she felt was considerably more efficient than Briggs's original system, a process that caused several long-time customers brief confusion and then consistent delight as they found things more easily. She hired a young woman from town named Sally as an assistant, partly because Sally was capable and partly because Eliza felt strongly that capable young women in Millhaven should have opportunities for skilled employment, and she paid Sally honestly and on time. The mercantile became, under Eliza's management, something more than a store. It became the kind of place people stopped when they didn't strictly need to, because she knew her customers and their needs, and she had opinions about what was worth carrying and what wasn't. And she had books, not many, but a rotating selection that she got from a supplier in San Antonio. And she had coffee going in a small pot in the corner during business hours, which in 1887 Texas was genuinely innovative and appreciated. Elias came by on Wednesday mornings and sat at the counter with his coffee and went over the ledger with her, their heads closed together over the numbers. And the Wednesday morning mercantile visit became a fixture that the town regarded as one of those things that reveals the fundamental nature of the people it involves. Thomas at 8 was already helping on the ranch, learning roping under Mateo's patient instruction and cattle management under his father's, and he had the quality Eliza had observed in Elias, that focused, unhurried attention to how things actually work, combined with something that was distinctly his own, a kind of easy, open warmth that came from, she suspected, growing up in a house where trust had been carefully rebuilt and then freely given. Eliza at 5 was reading, which delighted Eliza and did not surprise Elias, who said only that given Eliza's parentage, the question had not been whether but when. She read seriously and asked questions about what she read that were 3 levels more sophisticated than you'd expect from a 5-year-old, and she had her own opinions, clearly, about everything. James at 2 was a disaster of affectionate chaos, and they loved him completely. In the autumn of 1888, 10 years after Eliza had arrived in Millhaven with her enormous trunk and stood at the bottom of the hill in the rain, and watched a man in a gray hat carry her world up a slope without being asked, the town organized a small celebration for the Langston family to honor Elias' work in the cattle industry and Eliza's contribution to the community through the mercantile. A gesture that the town's current president of the church social committee presented as long overdue recognition of people who had given considerably more than they'd taken. The celebration was held outside, in the October afternoon, and it involved more food than was strictly necessary and several speeches of varying quality, and Mrs. Garvey, who was by then 70, and had entirely stopped apologizing for her opinions, telling the assembled company that she had known from the first week that those two were going to end up together. A claim that Eliza acknowledged with a smile and Elias received with the particular expression that was his version of a smile, and a raised eyebrow simultaneously. After the speeches and the food, in the late afternoon when the crowd had thinned, and the golden light was doing its October best across the Millhaven Valley, Eliza found herself standing beside Elias at the edge of the gathering, looking out at the town, and the rangeland beyond it, Thomas running somewhere with Mateo's younger siblings, Eliza sitting on a blanket with a book she'd brought because Eliza never went anywhere without a book, James asleep in Mrs. Garvey's capable arms. "We've done all right," Elias said. "We've done considerably better than all right," she said. "That's a more accurate assessment," he agreed. She looked at his profile, the gray hat at the angle she could have drawn from memory, the lines of his face that were deeper now at 35-45 now, 10 years of living in them. And she felt the specific, accumulated weight of a love that has survived seasons and had arguments and made decisions together and held each other through fear and built things that lasted. And she thought it was the most solid thing she had ever stood on. "Do you remember," she said, "what you thought about when you picked up my trunk?" "I've told you. Tell me again." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "I thought your face was interesting," he said. "And I thought nobody else was going to help you, and that was wrong. And I thought if I helped you I'd find out who you were. And I found out," he said. "Turns out you're someone who fixes her own porch steps and argues about fence lines and names her cows after biblical women and runs a mercantile that half the county couldn't do without and raises 3 children who appear to have inherited your opinions." "Your opinions too," she said. "Thomas has your eyes and your assessment of fence quality. Don't pretend otherwise." He made the low sound of amusement that she had loved for 10 years and showed no signs of loving less. He put his arm around her shoulders in the easy, unconsidered way of long habit, and she leaned into him with the same ease, and they stood together in the October afternoon and looked at their town and their life and the children who were their best work, and the sky above the Llano Estacado when its extraordinary colors, the same colors it had gone on the evening he'd kissed her for the first time on the rise of land above the creek. "Are you happy?" she said. She asked him this sometimes. Not because she doubted it, but because she believed that the question deserved to be asked aloud, regularly, between people who care about each other's actual interior state. He turned his head and looked at her with the expression that was entirely open, that had no distance in it at all. That was the face of a man who had come back from a very long way in the wrong direction and found something worth arriving for. "I'm happy," he said, "more than I knew how to be." She took his hand, the way she had the first time over the fence post, the same hand and the same clasp, but containing now 10 years of everything that hand had done: work and care, and late nights with sick animals and children, and the particular touch of a person who has learned your specific geography, the way you learn land you've worked for years, with intimacy that is physical and deeper than physical simultaneously. James made a sound from Mrs. Garvey's arms that indicated he was reconsidering the sleeping arrangement. Alina turned a page without looking up. Thomas appeared at a run from somewhere, red-faced and happy, pulling Mateo's youngest sister behind him by the hand with the easy friendliness of a child who has never been taught that connection is dangerous. The light went gold and then rose, and then the first blue of early evening. The celebration wound down around them in the warm way of good community events, people making their way home in the last light, calling their good nights, the ordinary beautiful machinery of a life that has found its proper shape. Eliza Sutton Langston, standing in the October dusk of 1888 in the town of Millhaven, Texas, with her husband's arm around her and her children in her sight and her land behind the ridge and her business on the main street, thought about the woman who had stood at the bottom of a hill in the rain with a trunk full of everything she owned and a spine held straight by pure, exhausted pride. And she sent that woman, across the years, something that felt like tenderness and recognition and gratitude. Because that woman had done something brave. She had arrived, she had stayed, she had fixed the porch step, she had shown the cow who had authority. And a man in a gray hat had picked up her trunk and carried it up a muddy hill and surprised a whole town and started the thing that turned out to be the most significant thing either of them had ever done. "Come on," Elias said, and the word "come on" from him in this context meant everything it had always meant: home and together and forward and permanent. She went with him into the October evening, hand in hand, their life large and solid around them, built from practical intelligence and honest argument, and the particular courage of two people who had both been hurt and chose, carefully and completely, to trust again. The creek would run through another winter and another spring. The garden would come up again. The cattle would move across the Golden Range. The mercantile would open on Wednesday morning, and Elias would be at the counter with his coffee and the ledger. Thomas would learn more about roping, and Alina would read another 3 books, and James would continue to be delightful chaos. And the fence line between what had been 2 separate properties would stand straight and true, as it had since the morning Hector moved it to the correct location, marking the boundary between 2 pieces of land that were separately owned and jointly loved by the same 2 people, which was, in the end, the only geography that had ever mattered.